Hello, and welcome to a tour of Jacksonville's historic homes. Our town was at first a gold rush town, cropping up in the mid-1800s. When the gold played out, many of the miners and their families liked the area and climate so well, they stayed, turning to agriculture and trade. At one point, Jacksonville was the Jackson County seat and largest city in southern Oregon, and the main trade hub for this area. Then the railroad came. Or rather, it didn't come. It preferred to lay its tracks on the smooth, flat land down the valley corridor, and thus Medford was born. The county seat was relocated, as was the trade. Jacksonville was forgotten for decades. But an interesting thing happened over the years. Jacksonville didn't change. When people started rediscovering Jacksonville, what they found was a city that had been frozen in time. They liked it a lot. It became important to preserve it in that pristine, historic condition, and so it remains. Our tour today will last about 45 minutes. The homes you'll see were built between 1855 and 1917 in the popular styles of their day: farmhouse, classical revival, Italianate villa, Victorian Gothic, Queen Anne, and craftsman. And it's important to remember that people who lived in the mid-1800s frowned on flashy display. No McMansions for that era. Most of the homes are modest versions of the period and the style, so much of our tour focuses on the pioneers who built and occupied them. We'll begin with the Plymale Cottage at 180 North Oregon Street, across the street from the Jacksonville Visitor Center. The cottage, built in 1868, is named after William Plymale. At age 15, he came across the Oregon Trail with his family, arriving in Jacksonville in 1852. Shortly afterwards, his father and oldest brother succumbed to typhoid fever, swamp fever as it was called, the earliest recorded deaths in Jacksonville. William became the man of the family, working to provide shelter and food for his mother and 5 surviving brothers and sisters. He farmed in the Applegate, worked as a surveyor, and edited a newspaper before being elected to the state legislature. When William returned to southern Oregon, he traded his farmland for a house, corral, and livery stable across the street at the northwest corner of Oregon and C Streets. David Lynn, the original owner and builder of the Plymale Cottage, owned a furniture factory at the corner of California and Oregon, where the telephone switching station now stands. When Lynn's factory burned to the ground in 1888, the Plymale House was also destroyed. William, his wife, and 9 children escaped with only the clothes on their backs. Lynn felt sorry for the family and sold William the cottage that now bears his name. William continued to operate his livery stable until his death in 1904. Can you hear the wagon heading out from the stable? Let's follow the horse's hooves south on Oregon Street for 3 blocks to number 310 at the corner of Oregon and Pine. Hermann von Helms of Holstein, Germany, arrived in Jacksonville in 1856. He soon became part owner, then full owner, of the Table Rock Billiard Saloon. That building, 2 blocks north on Oregon Street, still bears the sign. There were many saloons at this time in Jacksonville, and most were short-lived, but the Helms family operated the Table Rock Billiard Saloon for nearly 60 years. Helms attributed part of its success to the museum of oddities he had in the saloon. Everything from the first gold found in Oregon to the rope that hung the Modoc Indian Captain Jack. When Helms decided it was time to marry, he turned to the local German community. He wed Augusta Engelbrecht in 1862, one day after they were introduced.
When we began our married life, Herr Helms and I moved into the log cabin he had built on this site in 1856. Our family soon grew, and in 1878, Mr. Helms had a large 2-story, sort of Italian-looking addition built onto the front of the house. But we still kept the cabin for the kitchen and the pantry. People said that our new house was one of the most elegant houses in Jacksonville at that time. We had many memories, both good and bad, from our life in this home. Mr. Helms and I had 9 children, but only 5 survived. In 1868, during the typhoid epidemic, Our poor Minnie, she died when she was less than 2 years old. Since it was winter and the road to the cemetery was closed, we had to bury her at the front of our house outside. Our 2 girls, already young ladies, also died from the typhoid within 2 weeks of each other in 1889.
Unfortunately, the Helms tragedies did not end there. One of their older daughters was killed and her sister wounded in a domestic dispute with the sister's estranged husband. In 1926, years after Herman and Augusta had died, their son Harry put the house and furnishings on the market. Everything, even the pictures on the wall, were sold. It seemed Harry wanted nothing to remind him of those earlier years. 1 block south on Oregon is the classical revival-style home known as the Kovic House. However, the house was actually built around 1877 for George Schumpf, the town barber for most of his life. When Schumpf's wife died in 1882 from consumption of the bowels, in other words, cancer, he married her much younger caregiver. It seems, however, that Schumpf's first wife decided to hang around, or at least her ghost did. Previous as well as present owners have acknowledged seeing her. At first they were frightened, but now view her as a more comforting spirit. 3 proved to be a crowd, at least as far as Schumpf's second wife was concerned, and the house was sold to William and Addie Kovic in 1887. Kovic was a practicing attorney in Jacksonville. He served 4 years as county school superintendent and 3 terms as district attorney. It was only after this latter appointment that Kovic got around to taking the bar exam. Kovic also was an authority on Shakespeare, spoke fluent Chinook, the language of a local Indian tribe, and was among the party of soldiers that first mapped Crater Lake. The couple had 7 children. One of the sons, Vance, nicknamed Pinto because of his freckles, was the original creator of Bozo the Clown. As a result, this house is also known as the Bozo the Clown House. Pinto Kovic later worked as a cartoonist for Walt Disney and supplied many cartoon voices over the years, including those of Goofy, Pluto, and 2 of the 7 Dwarfs. He also wrote the song Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf? Returning half a block on Oregon Street, we arrive at the Eagle Brewery Saloon. The original Eagle Brewery, located a block north, was probably Jacksonville's first brewery. It may have been in operation as early as 1852. German-born Joseph Wetterer acquired both the original brewery and this lot in 1859, first constructing a grand brewery building, which at one point contained a malt kiln, mash tub, cooler, furnace heat, and a beer kettle. 2 years later, he built a saloon in front of his brewery. For the next 18 years, local newspapers regularly published advertisements for the Eagle Brewery, boasting the best lager beer in Southern Oregon. When Wetterer died in 1879, his wife, Frederica, attempted to keep the business going. However, 2 years later, the property was sold in a sheriff's auction to satisfy unpaid debts. By 1886, William Healy had acquired the property and married Frederica. He operated the brewery and saloon for the next few years, but by 1892, the property was characterized as dilapidated and vacant. The saloon was converted to a dwelling in the early 1900s, and in the early 1960s, the property was purchased by nationally renowned artist Eugene Bennett. Bennett lovingly restored the buildings, and the complex served as a studio and residence for 50 years, a far cry from its more raucous years as one of Jacksonville's earliest saloons. Next door at 305 South Oregon Street is the Casper Kubli House. The original occupant of the home was probably Reuben Maury. Maury was partners with Benjamin Davis in a general mercantile business that occupied the first brick building constructed in Jacksonville, just 1 block north on the site of Old City Hall. This house is also set on a brick foundation, unusual construction for a wood frame house of the early 1860s. The house has undergone considerable changes since that time. The original portion of the house started out with predominantly classical revival features, But with later additions of dormer, portico wrap, projecting gables, and a variety of exterior textures, it now has more of a Queen Anne disposition. Many of these changes can probably be attributed to Caspar Kubli, whose family occupied the house for over 25 years. Kubli, a native of Switzerland, arrived in Jacksonville in 1853. After trying his hand at mining, he went into business with fellow Swiss immigrant Peter Britt, packing supplies between Crescent City and Jacksonville. He later engaged in farming and stock raising, acquiring extensive landholdings. He expanded into merchandising, purchased a hardware business, and became a prominent Jacksonville merchant. Kubli was also active in politics and civic affairs. He was twice elected Jackson County Treasurer, was active in the management of the Presbyterian Church, was a member of Jacksonville's Oddfellows Lodge, and was elected Grand Patriarch of the Oddfellows Lodge of Oregon. Jacksonville's Oddfellows Hall is located just 1 block north at the corner of Oregon and Main Streets, and 1 block east on Main is the John Orth House.
In the late 1860s, I came to Jacksonville from my native Bayern, what you call Bavaria, where I'd been trained as a butcher. Jacksonville needed a good one, and they right away found out that I was one of the best. Soon I was able to afford a wife, and I found an Irish Fräulein Helen Hill. We had 9 children over the years. My butcher business was so successful that I built a large 2-story brick commercial building on South Oregon Street, which still bears my name. I used part of it for my butcher shop and rented out the rest. In 1878, I started buying lots at the corner of 3rd and Main and designing a home for my growing family. It was finally finished in 1880. A fine 2-story Italian-like villa. But before I could build, I had to get rid of the wood frame house that was already there. Being a frugal German, I couldn't see tearing it down. So I moved it 1 block away to the corner of 3rd and Fur.
Business was indeed good for the butcher John Orth. Not only did he build his large brick business and office building and his landmark home, he also purchased a 276-acre farm just east of Jacksonville. He was active in the community as well, serving several years as a city councilor and a term as county treasurer. The Orth House remained in the family until the 1930s. Half a block from here on 3rd Street is the P.J. Ryan Hotel, or Dwelling House. P.J. Ryan, a native of Tipperary, Ireland, arrived in Jacksonville around 1853 when he was 23 years old. He soon became one of the town's earliest and longest-term commercial property investors. Since fires had devastated the town a number of times, Ryan purchased or had built fire-proof brick buildings long before a city ordinance required it. Mr. Ryan built this simple structure around 1865. It's had an amazing number of incarnations for such a small building. Originally, it was Mr. Ryan's residence. By the late 1860s, it was a hotel, then a restaurant, then a doctor's office and residence. The 1870s saw it turn back into a hotel. In 1879, it was known as the Jacksonville Hotel. But by 1880, it had become a butcher shop, then an ice cream parlor. After a few years of standing vacant, it was resurrected as a saloon. The double front doors suggest that the building may have accommodated 2 businesses simultaneously. More recently, it was the residence of Robertson Collins. Collins is the individual who led the effort to prevent a proposed state highway from taking out 11 of Jacksonville's historic houses. He then led the organization that established the city's National Historic Landmark status in the 1960s. At the corner of 3rd and C Streets is the John Love House. This romantic-sounding structure was built around 1867 with the classical revival-style moldings, porch columns, and pilasters common in the mid-1800s. Mr. Love purchased this land in 1865 from James Cluggage, the man attributed with finding the first gold in this area and starting Oregon's gold rush. At one time, Mr. Cluggage owned most of Jacksonville. John Love was a partner with John Bilger in a very successful business, the merchandising of tin and hardware. The Love family didn't have long to enjoy this house that John built. Within months, John died from tuberculosis, and his wife Sophie and their 3 children had to move. 18 months later, Sophie and one of their daughters succumbed to smallpox and died during the epidemic that took the lives of many in Jacksonville. Sophia's mother, Marianne Harris Chambers, raised the remaining children. Her house is just across the street.
My first husband and I was farmers until the day he and our son was killed by engines. I figured the open country was no place for a woman and girl alone, so we moved into Jacksonville. A few years later, I married Mr. Aaron Chambers, and we built this fine house. The land was calling, though, so Aaron and I moved back out and started another farm. My daughter Sophie married John Love, what lived practically across the street. When John died, my Sophie and her young'uns moved over here for a year until the smallpox took her and my granddaughter Maggie. Then not 6 months later, my husband Aaron died. It was a rough time. But I took in the rest of my grandchildren, and I took care of them, and they took care of me. And together, we took care of the farm.
Marianne Chambers died in 1882 at the age of 61. The house stayed in the Love family for many more years. Next door at 240 3rd Street is the Matthew G. Kennedy House. The Matthew G. Kennedy House, built around 1855, is Jacksonville's oldest residential structure still in existence. Notice the stacked sandstone foundation without mortar. This type of foundation was once typical of very early Jacksonville buildings. The 2 front doors originally led into separate rooms, with the front porch serving as a hallway. Kennedy was one of Jacksonville's earliest pioneer residents and was appointed town constable at the youthful age of 24. After that, he was most likely the first elected sheriff of Jackson County. Kennedy also invested in Jacksonville real estate. Early on, the wooden buildings on the northern side of California Street between Oregon and 3rd were known as Kennedy's Row. But Kennedy also had a bit of the wanderlust. In 1857, he left Jacksonville to build a hotel called the Metropolitan House Hotel in Wairika, and by 1863, he'd moved on to San Francisco. Catty-cornered across the street is Applebaker Barn. This is one of Jacksonville's few remaining links to the town's original agricultural economy. Within 10 years of gold being discovered in Daisy Creek, surface deposits of that precious metal were nearly depleted. Those miners who stayed on turned to agriculture. It may be hard to believe now, but for over 30 years, Jacksonville was the leading agricultural and trade center and largest town in southern Oregon. This barn was built in 1880 as a steam-powered grist mill that supplied the locals with ground wheat, the staff of life. Within 2 years, the mill ranked 3rd in the state in flour production. The mill was originally located a few blocks to the south, but in 1915, Joseph Applebaker had the mill building dismantled, moved, and reconstructed on this site, although the current building probably looks different from the original. For many years, Applebaker ran his blacksmith business and later repaired wagons in the present barn structure. At the next corner at 3rd and D Streets is the Lewis Keegan House. Built by Minnie Lewis around 1908, this house is one of only 4 residents in Jacksonville with board and batten exterior sheathing. For much of its life, it was occupied by the family of Chris Keegan, a longtime Jacksonville saloon owner. Keegan was 16 when the family arrived in Jacksonville in 1882 from Clackamas County. His father, Owen, was bailiff and jailer at the county courthouse for 20 years. During his young adulthood, Chris was employed by marble cutter J.C. Whipp and is said to have carved many of the tombstone bases found at the Jacksonville Cemetery. At the corner of D and 4th Streets is the Kenny House, one of the few remaining Queen Anne-style homes in Jacksonville. Look for the varied exterior wall textures, the projecting bay windows, the acanthus leaf brackets under the second-floor overhang, and the recessed porch with its columns and balustrade. For many years, Thomas Kenny made and repaired saddles and harnesses. By the mid-1880s, he had become an insurance agent, but by 1906, he had moved over to the hardware and grocery business. Either he never quite found his niche, or he became another failed business statistic as Medford replaced Jacksonville as the regional business center. The house was acquired by the county in 1920 for unpaid taxes. Across 4th Street from the Kenny House is St. Joseph's Catholic Church. St. Joseph's, with its Gothic-style pointed arched windows and door, was possibly the first Catholic parish church built in southern Oregon. It has remained in continuous use since its completion in early 1859 and is the oldest Catholic church still standing in this part of the state. On the northwest corner of D and 5th Streets is the Methodist Episcopal Church. Built in 1854, this was the first church built in Jacksonville and is the oldest surviving wood frame building in town. It's also the oldest existing church in southern Oregon. Local folklore has it that the ladies of the town raised the money to build it by going from mining camp to mining camp and saloon to saloon. The church originally faced North 4th Street, but when 5th Street became the main route to Medford, the church fathers turned the whole building around. On the southwest corner is the Magnolia Inn, built in the early 1900s as Mitchell's Sanitarium, a sanitarium and health spa. This was part of the Wellville movement pioneered by the Kellogg brothers, creators of Kellogg's cornflakes. The Wellville approach to medicine promoted holistic treatments and vegetarianism, and a typical stay at such a sanitarium would have included enemas and exercise. Across North 5th Street from the Magnolia Inn is the historic Jackson County Courthouse. This impressive Italianate-style structure was completed in 1884, the same year the railroad bypassed Jacksonville. This was home to county government until 1927, when the county seat was moved to Medford. The smaller building you see off to its side used to be the county jail. 1 block south at the corner of 5th and C Streets is the Karevsky House.
I am Gustav Karevsky, and this is my house. As young man, I come from Prussia in 1853 for the gold. But soon I find there was more gold selling shovels than using them. I opened my own dry goods store. I even ran pack mule train from Wairika to bring mine goods. It was cheaper and it arrived on time. Then I find that flour was scarce and profitable. So I buy Rogue River steam flouring mill. I kept that mill my whole life. Then farming became more important than mining. I changed too. Karevsky's agricultural implements to only dealer in the Rogue Valley for big farm machines, plows, graders, harvesters, and those new steam tractors.
The recently widowed Joanna Levy first bought the 5th Street house in 1870. Karevsky was a close friend of her late husband and handled his estate. When she and Karevsky married, he joined her there, making some nice additions to the home, including extending the porch and modifying the lower gabled roof into a broad-hipped roof, a unique feature of the house. At the southwest corner of California and South 5th, you'll find the elegant Mccully House. John and Jane Mccully were influential figures in the commercial and cultural development of Jacksonville.
When my husband, Dr. John Mccully, and I arrived in Jacksonville in 1852, we soon learned there was little demand for a doctor's services. Miners were accustomed to enduring pain and discomfort. Although I had been educated as a teacher, there was no demand for those skills either. So I baked bread, cakes, and pies and sold them for $1 each. The miners, who lived mostly on beans and bacon, could not get enough of my baked goods. The next few years saw an influx of settlers. John's medical practice was finally in demand, and we prospered along with the town. With that additional income, John began speculating in land. He bought part interest in a saloon and a dairy, and then borrowed against his holdings to build the most costly structure in Jacksonville, the 2-story building that now houses the Oddfellows Hall. With his election to the territorial legislature, John considered himself a man of stature. He decided we needed a grand new house worthy of his prominence. Although we were deeply in debt, a fact I was not aware of, he built this beautiful classic revival house, at the time the most elegant home in Jacksonville. Unfortunately, John was in over his head. He was facing financial ruin, and his creditors were unforgiving. One night, under cover of darkness, John took the stagecoach out of town, leaving me to deal with his creditors, 3 small children, and almost $8,000 in debts. I never saw John Mccully again in my life.
Jane Mccully had to tap all of her resources. She wanted to start a school, but lacked money for books and supplies. She leased the ground floor of this beautiful home to a couple who ran it as a boarding house, while she supplied their baked goods. That enabled her to scrape by until she could open her school in 1862. She taught English, piano, drawing, and painting, and was the only teacher a whole generation in these parts ever knew. And over the years, she also paid off all the outstanding debt. Half a block west on California Street is the Derebaum House. The Jean Saint-Luc Derebaum House was constructed in 1893 and incorporated much of the Queen Anne style, so popular in that day. The early history of Mr. Derebaum varies. One account has it that he was the son of a wealthy family, but after offending his father at age 12, had run off and joined the French Navy. He then sailed the world, fought in the Crimean War, and received a silver medal from Queen Victoria. Another account states that he was reared on a farm in France and later became a government employee. Not quite as glamorous, but probably closer to the truth. After the death of his first wife in 1870, Derebaum immigrated to the U.S. with his children and settled in Jacksonville. He soon married a Prussian widow, Henrietta Schmidling, who had been left quite well off by her late husband. Derebaum's sister owned and ran the United States Hotel in downtown Jacksonville. When she died, Jean took it over and vastly renovated it, even putting in a skating rink. Unfortunately, he didn't have the business instincts of his sister. Within a few years, the hotel was put on the auction block for unpaid mortgages. Well, Henrietta saved the day by making the highest bid to buy it back. She paid $4,325 in gold coin for the hotel. She then decided she wanted her own residence and commissioned the home you see today, replacing a pioneer wood frame structure that had been built around 1855. At 470 East California is the C.C. Beekman House, a 1.5-story wood frame structure constructed in the early 1870s. It's a bit of a mixed bag architecturally speaking. The steep gables, dormer, and latticework porch trim are characteristics of the Gothic Revival style. The pilaster cornerboards, door sidelights, and transom are elements of classical Revival architecture. Cornelius C. Beekman was one of Jacksonville's earliest pioneer settlers and a long-term resident of the town. Born in New York City, he sailed to San Francisco via the Isthmus of Panama in 1850, arriving in Jacksonville in 1853.
I came to Jacksonville as an express agent for Cram Rogers and Company. When they closed shop, I bought up their stable and corral and set up Beekman's Express, transporting goods and gold between here and Wairika. I also purchased a large safe and offered to look after the miners' gold. You might say that my safe was the first financial institution between San Francisco and Portland. For many years, most of the gold discovered in this district passed over my counter, about $40 million worth at the time.
Beekman invested his profits wisely. Real estate, mining, and various other business interests. He was an influential figure in many local, state, civic, and municipal undertakings as well. Beekman served on the school board, was mayor of Jacksonville for a term, was a delegate to the Republican National Convention, and was the Republican candidate for governor of Oregon, losing by only 70 votes. For 15 years, he was a regent for the University of Oregon. The Beekman Professorship of Northwest and Pacific History is the oldest endowed chair at the university. Beekman married Julia Elizabeth Hoffman in 1861, and the couple had 3 children. Beekman's daughter Carrie donated this house and all of its possessions to the public in 1959 so that future generations could learn about their pioneer family. The house remains completely furnished with family artifacts. It is now owned by the city of Jacksonville. A variety of tours are offered throughout the year. On the other side of Laurelwood Street is the home of Thomas G. Reams, who became Beekman's partner in the banking industry and many of his other endeavors. With the Beekman House, the Reams House, the Muller home across the street, and other homes no longer in existence, we are on Jacksonville's pioneer equivalent of Millionaire's Row. These men were all self-made, building both their fortunes and these fine homes in Jacksonville. Thomas Givings Reams drove a wagon across the Oregon Trail when he was 13 and worked as a stevedore for the Hudson Bay Company at age 14. The lure of gold and land brought him to Jacksonville when he was 15. Over the next few years, Reams served as deputy sheriff, ran a livery stable, and finally opened a mercantile business. By the time he was 28, he was sufficiently prosperous to court and marry his wife Lucinda and purchase the deed to this property. Reams became a banking associate of his neighbor, C.C. Beekman. They acquired extensive land holdings and even lent money to the local government. Reams was also prominent in local, county, and state politics, serving as Jacksonville mayor and city councilman for years, as postal inspector for 5 western states, and as a delegate to the National Democratic Convention. In 1878, he was appointed Brigadier General of the Oregon Militia, a title he thoroughly enjoyed. The first house Reams built on this site was a simple one-story building, which reportedly constitutes part of the first floor of this structure. But as Reams became more successful and his family grew, the house became bigger and bigger. Thomas and Lucinda eventually raised 10 children in this house, which now exhibits many details characteristic of Queen Anne architecture and is one of the larger homes in Jacksonville. Ironically, after all of General Reams' successes, he died at age 61 due to complications from a cold. Across the street at 465 California is the home of Max and Louisa Mueller. Max Mueller was born to a Jewish family in Bavaria, Germany in 1836.
It was difficult for Jews living in Europe at that time. I was desperate for an opportunity, so when I was 15, I came to America to seek my fortune. My search led me westward to Jacksonville, Oregon. It was 1855, and Jacksonville was still a gold rush town dominated by miners, traders, and backwoods pioneers. However, I saw the business opportunity and the town's potential to grow into a thriving, respectable community. I set about becoming established in both business and politics, and I succeeded. In addition to running a successful dry goods store, I became a proud member of the Red Men and served as secretary of the Masonic Lodge for almost 32 years. I also served as a city trustee, city treasurer, county treasurer, and Jackson County clerk, and I was Jacksonville's first postmaster, a position I held for 18 years.
Mueller became one of the most prominent and wealthy businessmen in town. He married his German wife Louisa in 1868, and they proceeded to have 6 children. In 1887, he built this fine house in the high Victorian Italianate style for his growing family. Louisa loved the house, especially the fact that it had 2 parlors. The Muellers lived here for 15 years until Max died of a stroke at age 66, and Louisa moved to California to help raise the grandchildren. West on California, at the corner of 6th Street, is Jacksonville's historic Presbyterian Church. Although all of Jacksonville's pioneer churches have elements of Victorian Gothic architecture, The historic Presbyterian church is definitely the most striking example, with its pointed arch windows and door openings, its soaring steeple, and the steep pitch of the roof. From 1855 through the turn of the century, many churches were built in the Gothic style due to the close association of this architecture with the Christian faith. The design itself was probably taken from one of the architectural pattern books that were widely circulated in the late 1800s. Across the street at 375 East California is the G.W. Kool House, a small cottage built in the salt box style, more typical of New England. It was built in 1858 and has had a number of owners through the years. When Mr. Kool, perhaps somewhat presumptuously, had the house built, at least 7 different people claimed title to the land. That was resolved when James Cluggage, one of the mule packers who discovered gold in this area, was granted the rights for nearly all the original town sites in Jacksonville. In 1863, Cluggage deeded the parcel to banker C.C. Beekman, who lived here when he was first married and starting a family. 2 blocks north on 6th Street is an interesting little intersection. The house at the southeast corner of 6th and D used to be the sheriff's house, conveniently located across the street from the county jail. It fell to the sheriff's wife to feed whatever citizens were enjoying county hospitality. Since our winters can get cold and wet, a resourceful sheriff somewhere down the line had a tunnel dug from his home under the street and into the jail, so his wife could supply the necessary meals with a minimum of hardship. At the northeast corner of 6th and D is the Collar family house. The original house on this site was built in 1880 for Robert Collar. His parents were one of the first pioneer families to settle in the Rogue River Valley. 3 of the Collar boys did quite well. Robert Collar, a druggist, dispensed drugs, books, and stationery from his building on California Street. George was a practicing surgeon and physician in Jacksonville. Charles Wesley Collar, who built the current house, was a prominent Jacksonville attorney. When Robert purchased this land in 1879, it contained a simple wood-frame dwelling. However, when C.W. built the current home around 1910, he incorporated such popular Queen Anne features as the second-story porch and the large porch gable, highlighted by fish-scale shingles. The house at the northwest corner of this intersection and the one next to it were built by Gustav Karevsky as rental houses. In 1870, Jacksonville was booming, and newcomers needed accommodations. Local entrepreneurs augmented their incomes by building or investing in rental properties. Real estate speculation has been around for a long time. A couple blocks north on Blackstone Alley is the John Bilger House. The Bilger House, constructed around 1863, is probably the only home in Jacksonville built in the federal style, with its rectangular floor plan and symmetrical design. See how the tall, narrow second-story windows are set immediately below the frieze board, and how the front door is surrounded by sidelights and a transom. Around 1856, John Love and John Bilger were partners in one of Jacksonville's earliest and most successful enterprises. Their store was called Love and Bilger and sold tin plate and sheet iron to the public. After Love died, Bilger expanded the merchandise to include all kinds of hardware and farming implements. It was quite the going concern. Bilger reported an annual income of $1,000 in 1868, making him the wealthiest man in town. John Bilger married the German-born Amanda Scheck in 1861, and they had 8 children over the years. When Bilger died in the cholera epidemic of 1877, Amanda took over the hardware store. By the mid-1880s, she had expanded into manufacturing in partnership with a Mr. Meghly, and Bilger and Meghly became one of the leading manufacturers of agricultural machinery and implements in Jacksonville. Nearby on 5th Street is the B.F. Dowel House. The Dowel House, with its low-hipped roof and tall arched windows, is one of the earliest Italianate-style houses built in Oregon. Constructed in 1861, it may have been the first home in Jacksonville to be built of brick. It certainly was one of the finest homes in the still young mining community. Most homes of the period had wood-burning stoves for heat, but this distinctive home has 4 fireplaces, 1 of black onyx and 3 of marble. The marble probably came from Mr. Dowell's own marble quarry on Williams Creek. That same marble was also used for the porch steps and all the window sills. The home was built for attorney Benjamin Franklin Dowell, named for his grandmother's uncle, the great man himself.
I was lured west by the promise of gold, but the hard conditions soon robbed me of my health. I spent the next 4 years trading and packing supplies for the miners. By then, there was a call for my University of Virginia law degree, and I returned to the practice of law. Over the years, I served as prosecuting attorney for Oregon's 1st Judicial District and as U.S. District Attorney. I found I liked swaying public opinion as much as I liked setting legal precedents, and for 14 years I owned the Oregon Sentinel newspaper. I'm proud to say that the Sentinel was the first newspaper in the Pacific Northwest to support the abolition of slavery and the first to nominate Ulysses S. Grant for president.
Now we'll cross over to North Oregon and jump forward half a century to the Tuvel House, one of the better examples of craftsman-style homes in the Rogue Valley. The first house to stand on this elevated knoll was a rude cabin built around 1855 by William Hoffman. That same year, Hoffman was elected county auditor under the Oregon Territory. When Oregon became a state in 1859, he became the first elected clerk of Jackson County. With increased means, Hoffman tore down the cabin in 1866 and built a 1.5-story frame cottage and an adjacent barn. The barn still stands, and the rear portion of the Hoffman House was incorporated into the present structure. Frank Tuvel, who came to the Rogue Valley in 1905, purchased the Hoffman property in 1912. His wife, Elizabeth, was responsible for the design of the house you see today. Tuvel was part of the early 20th century orchard boom movement that launched the commercial pear and apple industries in the Rogue Valley. In later years, he donated 50 acres of his vast land holdings to the state as parkland. This Rogue River recreation area now bears his name, Tuvel State Park. While serving as county judge of Jackson County, Tuvel successfully campaigned for road improvements, and in 1935 he was appointed State Highway Commissioner. He was directly responsible for the relocation and construction of Highway 99 over the Siskiyou Mountains, as well as for the Coast Highway 101. After Frank Tuvel died in 1955, the contents of the house were auctioned at an estate sale. Subsequent owners have returned the house to its former glory. Another 2 blocks north on Oregon Street is our final stop, the Noonan House, the crown jewel of Jacksonville, and the last major house built in what had become a dying town. The lovely Noonan House, built in 1892, was the last of 3 houses in Jacksonville based on a design by Tennessee architect George F. Barber. The plans were purchased directly from Barber's The Cottage Souvenir catalog, hence its nickname, the Catalog House. Despite rumors to the contrary, only the plans and the fancier woods were brought in by rail. Most of the materials and workmanship were local. The Noonan House undoubtedly reflects the character and personality of its original owner, Jeremiah Noonan, an entrepreneur involved in general merchandising, farming, mining, and insurance businesses. He also served as town trustee, recorder, and police judge. Noonan was born in Ireland around 1843, immigrated to America, and then came west like so many others, settling in Jacksonville in the late 1860s. Here he opened a saddlery business in competition with Henry Judge. Noonan and Judge became friends, and in 1872 Noonan married Delia O'Grady, the younger sister of Judge's wife. Noonan had this house built for Delia as a Christmas present.
We dearly loved our magnificent home. Jeremiah had insisted on the finest workmanship. Our staircase alone was made from 5 different types of wood, and our 5 mantelpieces were all hand-carved. Jeremiah also had stained glass windows placed throughout the house. The house has 16 rooms, including 5 bedrooms. Jeremiah even made sure I had a sewing room, which I put to good use. And would you believe that we had electricity installed in 1909? Why, we had barely gotten used to having electricity when Jeremiah had indoor plumbing installed. To be able to pull a switch and have electricity, let alone indoor facilities. My, such changes.
This house is considered an excellent example of the Queen Anne style, which uses a variety of forms, textures, materials, and colors. The Noonan House has had various owners over the years, and only 3 of the estate's original 11 acres remain intact. However, the house still retains its unabashed exuberance and remains symbolic of an earlier era in Jacksonville's history, one of lusty gold mining and productive agricultural trade. Thank you for allowing us to share with you a bit of Jacksonville and Oregon history.